Well, Pastor Steve, we have a very interesting podcast today, still on the topic of bibliology. For those of you tuning in, we've had a couple of guest speakers from our missions conference speak in our last couple of episodes. We're getting back into theology, specifically on bibliology, and we got a doozy for you. We're going to be talking about why we have so many different Bible translations, not just in English, but across the world, multitudes of translations, but also how did we get there, the transmission of that information. And so this is Tin Cup Theology. We're your hosts. I'm Chris.
Steve.
Cheers. And we're talking about the Bible. Now, I remember for me, as I was growing up, the journey of the Bibles that I have, the collection of Bibles that I have, is pretty extensive. I grew up in the church, born and raised, and I remember constantly in VBS professing my faith and closing my eyes and raising my hand so that I could get a free colored book and a free Bible. That's just me. So I constantly said I believed in Jesus and I was a sinner over and over so I could get the free stuff. So I have a collection of different children's Bibles. But then from there, as I grew older in my faith, then it was the NIV, but not just any NIV. It was the 1984 version of the NIV, what everyone claims to be the better NIV version. In case you don't know what I'm talking about, NIV was updated in 2011. And people didn't like that. And so it was around 2011 that I actually switched versions. Everyone was switching, and that was kind of the rise of John MacArthur and his in kind of my generation and his understanding. And it was all about the NASB. It's all that you get, the John MacArthur Study Bible, which was an NASB. If you are a faithful follower of Jesus, you got to get word for word NASB. And so that was what I studied all throughout college. I was using teaching Bible study out of NASB. And then as I came out of college and I was touring as a Christian, with a Christian band, and then I was going to seminary, things actually started shifting for me into the ESV, which was, I don't want to call it the replacement for the 1984 NIV, but it wasn't it was more understandable, but still had good word-for-word literal translations, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And then I discovered the beautiful New Living Translation. Now, don't hang me on a cross if you do, so be it, but hang me upside down. But the New Living Translation, which just, after going through seminary, studying the text, I started looking at both the NASB and the ESV as textbooks, not as the Word of God that is living and meaningful and powerful and impactful in my life. And so I knew it was, but I needed to find something that was more meaningful and powerful, and I found the New Living Translation, which is a little more on the scale of meaning for meaning, not so much literal, and it just helped me, and still today helps me in my own personal growth in engaging with the Word of God and my relationship.
Well, but confession here.
Yeah. Oh.
I also like doing my devotions in the NLT as
well. Okay. So. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the podcast, which versions we actually prefer and use. But again, my Bible translations, perhaps even yours, Pastor Steve, has been quite extensive. Which versions we use, which versions we preach from, which versions we like to study. So today our goal is to help all of you, our listeners, talk about the transmission of the physical written words of the Bible in its original language or from its original autograph, its original language, to what we have today, the multitudes of translations we have today. And so with that, let's just talk about the Bible, right? Most of it, especially Old Testament, much of it, there's steeped in oral tradition, communication. But I would even say, even Paul, studies of or archaeologists have communicated that Paul actually verbally communicated his letters, and it was written by someone else. And so let's talk about its physical writing down of the words of God in the Bible. How was the Bible written?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially for those of you who love stationery stores, right? You want to
Hobby Lobby.
Hobby Lobby. My kids would love the Muji pens and the paper you would write on. All that mattered, and it did so also with the Bible. The Bible was written originally on papyrus. Papyrus would be the inside of a reed plant that grew abundantly on the Nile River. and so they would take the inside fiber and they would cut it into thin strips and then lay it side by side and make it form a flat surface. After it was dried, it was smoothed, and then they would join it together with a type of a glue. It would be 30 to 90 feet long. The problem with papyrus, that was called paper in 2 John 12, when John said he's writing with paper and ink. The problem with it doesn't last very long. It's plant-based, and they would disintegrate quite easily, which is why we don't have the original autographs any longer. Then they would write on animal skin. Vellum was a very fine quality from the skin of calves and antelopes. That was what John described as the scroll in Revelation 5:1, written on the inside and the back, sealed with 7 seals. So that was a vellum scroll. And then there was parchment that was made from sheep and goats. And so you can imagine it's heavier than the plant-based type papyrus. And then paper was used after the 14th century. Even though it was invented in China in the 2nd century, it didn't become popular towards the Middle East and Europe until the 10th, 12th century, and it became a regular surface. Then they would, before it was scrolls, so they would roll it up, the papyrus or the animal skins, and carry it around as a scroll. Later, it would become a book with a back binding called a codex. And so the codex would have the binding where you can flip the pages like the books we have nowadays.
Now, just to put a pause really quick, I didn't realize that in Revelations it was talking about vellum, or the skins in that scroll. This might be helpful before we continue on. When it comes to the physical paper or what it was written on, we're not talking about the ink. Are you saying that within the scope of the New Testament in which we have, not everything was written in like what people were referring to, or even what some of the apostles were reading from, were not the original autographs? They were copies of those original autographs because of its deterioration rate?
Probably both.
Okay.
I mean, the originals were passed around the church pretty immediately.
Yep.
You know, but then while they're there in Colossae, they're saying, "Well, hey, let's get our copy, right? And so we can read it again, and then we'll send the original, or let's make a couple of copies, and we can get it over to Thessalonica, or So it would be."
I find that very profound, because I just always assumed we have the Bible, the original autograph. They must have only had the original autograph the whole time. But it's true, papyrus disintegrated so quickly. Yeah. We're not talking about, it would disintegrate with it, especially being used, open, closed, open, closed. Who knows how long it lasted, right? 10, 15, 20 years. And so they need other
if it was taken care of really well, it might last 100 years.
Yes.
Right? I mean, they might still find some fragments, but, even paper today, the oil from your thumb will ruin paper today.
Okay.
Right? So...
Well, sorry, continue on. So that's the paper. So I find that very profound, that it's possible that the apostles, and especially in Revelations, when it's talking about not using the original autographs, but it's talking about the scrolls using the skin of animals, that helps me a little bit more in understanding Kyle's community. Yep. So credibility is a better way to put it.
What was their Muji pen or whatever they wrote with?
How fine of a point.
They used the reeds because they would be hollow on the inside, and they would be able to contain ink, and they used that till the 5th century. Then they would use feather pens called quill pens until the printing press, and then the printing press in the 15th century just gave a real great sense of mass reproduction. But it's interesting, when they wrote all in capital letters until the 9th century, AD, and then
my dad still writes in capital letters. Architects.
Well, that's good, and I think I need to, because my handwriting's so messy. I can't even read my small lowercase letters. But they started using lowercase letters after the 9th century. they would write without punctuations in the scriptures. And, I mean, that matters, right? Like punctuation and spacing between the words is the difference between God is now here versus God is nowhere, right? And I mean, it's all the same letters. And, if you don't have spacings or punctuations, it can become difficult. So the Bible was written continuously without spaces, punctuations, for the longest time, just in capital letters. And it wasn't until about the 1500s, a fellow by the name of Arius Montanus, in 1571, he started dividing chapters. The New Testament, Stephen Langton, who was a professor at the University of Paris and Archbishop of Canterbury, he gave the modern chapter divisions around 1227 AD. So they weren't divided into chapters quite yet. The verses were divided in the Old Testament when the group called the Masoretes started to insert vowels. So the original Old Testament was just consonants. And so vowels were not written or added until the 5th to the 10th century. So if you can imagine, you're reading right to left, you're reading with no punctuation or spaces, and then no vowels either. Vanna White wouldn't even turn a vowel for him. And so, and then for the New Testament, a fellow by the name of Robert Stephanus, he marked the verses for the purpose of cross-referencing with the Latin Vulgate, and those were the beginning of the Bible that we're starting to see today.
Now,
Go ahead.
Now, when it comes to like the punctuations, the spaces, the chapter divisions, were they just aimlessly put like this makes sense here, or were they looking at the manuscripts in its original language, Hebrew, and Greek, and Latin, and it was translated Latin, but and that's where they got those punctuations? Or?
No, because in the original they didn't have those punctuations or spaces.
Okay, so how did they get to that?
They through discernment.
Okay,
probably reading, probably sitting in a room, and people are trying to say, what do you think? You think it's better here or better here?
Okay.
And what's been traditionally taught, and when they do the public readings,
sure. How
was it read publicly?
Sure.
Right, and then they would have an idea of how which words were divided,
sure.
which verses might be divided, and
so would you say that the individuals that added the punctuations, chapter divisions, verse divisions, were basing it off of meaning for meaning rather than word for word?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's why, like, if you're reading the scriptures and then you would say, well, this is kind of weird that this verse probably fits better in the last chapter. It's because there were no chapter divisions originally, maybe they could have made a better decision. But again, the verse divisions and the chapter divisions are not inspired, so it doesn't affect the meaning.
Okay. So then let's talk about that. We started talking a little bit about going from transmission to translation, and I started using phrases like meaning for meaning, word for word. How do we get from the original autographs, and we just talked about that it's possible in the New Testament they were using manuscripts rather than the original autographs, which I find profound. But nonetheless, how do we get from the autographs all the way to what we just talked about earlier, the ESV, the NASB, the modern translations that we have today?
An autograph, again, refers to the original writing.
Yep.
I remember I went to Ceremony Mall, and I got the autograph of Bobby Bonds, whose son would be Barry Bonds right up there, right? But I remember he autographed my glove. Right? It was not a facsimile autograph. It was the original autograph, right, of Bobby Bonds. And so when we use autograph, it refers to the original writing. When we start talking about manuscripts, that word literally means handwriting. Those would start to be the copies of it. A translation is when it crosses languages.
Okay.
And a version is if it's translated out of the original language. And so that's why the King James Version or the New International Version, they were translated from the original Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, which were the languages that the Bible was written in. A few Latin words there, because of the Roman times. Aramaic was the common language of the day. That's what Jesus spoke on the everyday basis. But then the common language for the New Testament was Koine Greek, and the original language for the Old Testament was Hebrew. Hebrew being a very pictorial, vivid, metaphorical language. It gave pictures in its words, very personal and biographical. And then the New Testament, there were various stages of the Greek language, the Homeric, Attic, Koine, Byzantine, and today they use modern Greek. But the Koine Greek Koine means common. It was the common everyday language. There was a more official type of Greek that was used when you read the philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. But the everyday street talk, was more.
It's like
Koine
Mandarin,
Greek.
Cantonese,
That's
Toisan.
right.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. So when you take those original languages and then you put that into a translation or a version, translates from the original. So like the Living Bible is not a version because it's a paraphrase.
The Living Bible.
The Living Bible by Ken Taylor.
Okay.
Right. He didn't use the Hebrew and Greek for his translation.
Oh, he used a English version.
He used
or
King James.
King James.
And he says, whoa, this is too hard for kids to understand. He wanted his grandkids to be able to understand it. So he took the King James and he just kind of made it more simple. So that would not be a version.
Okay.
It's a paraphrase, which means it's rephrasing.
So you wouldn't even call that a translation?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then, very similar to like The Message.
Yes.
From Eugene Pat.
Yeah,
okay.
Right.
So let's. So I got a little confused between the difference between Bible versions and Bible translations. What's the difference again? Can you explain?
So translation is it's just basically like you interpret another language.
Okay.
Right? So that's the broader category.
Okay. So it's like going from what they had from Latin to English or something like that. Okay. Okay.
So a version is a type of translation.
Okay.
So it's in it's a subcategory of the broader category of translations.
Okay.
Where you're translating from the original languages.
Okay.
So that's how they use the term version today. So that's all part of the vocabulary.
Sure.
When you're reading these things, and what does that mean?
Okay. So then let's talk about the versions/translations of modern day and what we have today, because it seems like it almost seems like the manuscripts are very trustworthy, right? Because they were written long time ago and still probably in its original state, right? Based off of the autographs, they were word for word. There was no need for meaning because they were manuscripts, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? They were manuscripts, word for word. Maybe some words changed here based on the culture, but they were manuscripts. But then you go from the manuscripts to the translations or versions. Which one happens first?
Well, versions are a type of translation.
Okay.
So there are some translations that went from the Latin Vulgate into the English language.
Okay.
Right? So they bypass the Greek and Hebrew.
Okay.
When they use the Greek and Hebrew, then it's a version.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's just a translation.
So then was the Latin Vulgate a version?
The Latin Vulgate was a version because Jerome sought to.
Is it similar to that of the Septuagint in which Jesus was using?
Right. The Septuagint
of the Old Testament.
Is the Greek. Is the Greek version or translation? A version or translation would work either way of the Hebrew Old Testament.
Got it. Okay. So given that, and now we have the English, right? It seems like it's going through many different cultures. It's going through many different languages. How do we know, specifically for our audiences today? Like we're not in South America. We're not in Africa. We're here in America. We speak English. That sounds really political. It's not. We speak English. That's kind of the language that we use. How do we know that the translations that we have today are accurate? because it seems to have gone through so many different filters.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We know that it's accurate, first of all, through a phrase that we call lower criticism, is where you take all the different texts that we have accessible. And
is that including the manuscripts that we have that are accessible?
Right.
Okay.
Right. The manuscripts, citations by church fathers. There's different families of manuscripts. Actually, there's some from Egypt, from Syria, Ethiopia, Armenia, Georgia, which is the Russia Georgia, not the Atlanta Georgia, Arabic, Gothic, Slavonic, and then Latin versions. And so you're putting all of these out there, and you're comparing all these different types of text. And then you're trying to assemble the best type of collection possible.
Sure.
And so it's interesting that there was like we talked about with the Old Testament texts, were copied by the Masoretes. So we have what's called the Masoretic text.
Okay.
Right. The Septuagint translated that into Greek, so that's the Greek version of the Old Testament used in Jesus' day.
Okay.
And then this textual scholarship was there was a great work done by a fellow by the name of Erasmus in 1515.
Okay.
He was a brilliant scholar, and he came up with what's called the Textus Receptus, which is Latin for the received text, Textus Receptus. And he dedicated it to Pope Leo X in 1516. It was based on a lot of the manuscripts that came from the Byzantine area. Okay. And so there were more of those texts, but they were older and they were earlier in earlier in age.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So because what happens, like we said, a lot of the texts break down,
yes,
or the manuscripts break down, yep, and we lose them. So the older they are, there's going to be fewer of them.
Yep.
The newer they are, there's going to be more of them.
Okay. And
so those were the texts which comprise the Textus Receptus, which is the basis for the King James Version.
Ah.
So so that was the 1516 edition and 1611.
Okay.
When they were deciding, okay, which Greek New Testament collection shall we use to do our translation on? They chose the Textus Receptus.
Okay.
And so that's important to note later on. Now, later on in time, there's been more findings of texts that are older.
Yes.
And the idea here is that the older they are, the more accurate they're going to be. Because from the time, if they're earlier to us, that would be a longer time from when they were originally written. And there's there could be more interpretation, corruption, just errors, that can be that can come across. And so the first break from the Textus Receptus as that collection of the Greek texts we can use for the New Testament was done by Westcott and Hort, who were a couple of liberals who people would just say, oh well, they're liberals and we don't want to have anything to do with Westcott and Hort, but their method was a good method. And so fundamentalist theologian B.B. Warfield, I have Warfield's theology right there, but B.B. Warfield used their approach to determine the inerrant originals in defending the Bible in 1886. Okay. Since then, that Nestle Allen, which is probably what you and I had in our Greek classes, it's a more moderate version than Westcott and Hort. And so those would have more of the earlier texts where the Textus Receptus relied on newer texts from the Byzantine area, the Nestle Aland is depending on earlier text from the Alexandrian region, and so they got, it's drier, right? It's in that part of Egypt, and so the texts were better preserved, but they're older. And so they use those to form these Greek translations.
And the assumption is the older, the more credible.
Yes.
Okay.
So I mentioned that because there's debate. There's people who will like the King James more, and they say, well, they came from the Textus Receptus, and we have more manuscripts, but they're newer. Right? And then there's other folks who would say, well, we like the Nestle Aland because they're older texts, even though they're fewer. The New American Standard, the NIV, the ESV, they're based on the Nestle Aland. And so, and so, hence, the debate can be launched among some, but for you and me, I don't think it matters. A whole lot.
All right.
I'm not smart enough to
so then, this is more of an application. We tend to do application at the end. Before we get to our next question on continuing translations, given the fact that there are many translations of the manuscripts which are based off the original autographs, and there's continual discovery of newer manuscripts and older manuscripts, depending on what region, there's constantly discovering these things. What would you say to us as Christians who have our English version, whatever version that may be, what is the appropriate way to look at the physical version Bible that we have today, knowing that there's new discoveries? What should be the attitude toward it?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, number one, I think a great degree of confidence.
Okay.
Because I think when you compare them both, they're not super different.
Like the Westcott versus the Nestle Aland.
Or even the Textus Receptus.
Okay, Textus Receptus. Okay.
Right? I mean, that's the reason why there's the King James has more verses at the end of Mark than you would find in the NIV or New American.
Yeah.
Because they're not found in and then you'll see these little margins. They're not found in the older texts, right? And so that's what those little marginal notes would refer to. So I would say there's great confidence in it, but it's also exciting because there are new discoveries being made, which brings us even closer to the original, right? So so the more information you get, the more access we have to make a determination in terms of what was in the original. And as they have found that, there's been upgrades to some modern translations, such as there was the Holman Christian Bible. Yeah. That has just been because of new discoveries.
That's what we were told to study from in seminary for me.
Oh,
at Gateway, the Holman,
yeah. Very, very popular among the Southern Baptists.
Yep, exactly.
Right. So now the Christian Standard Bible has upgraded that translation because of what's been found in 20 years. Also, the new Legacy Standard Bible. Was a joint venture by the Lockman Foundation, 316, and MacArthur Foundation to upgrade the New American Standard from 1995 with all of the new the new findings and so that's a reworking of the New American Standard in what they call the LSB or the Legacy Standard Bible. Right. So
this is hot news. NASB is now updated.
Not everybody likes the updates.
Yeah.
That's for you to decide. But with that confidence, because there's been 2,000 years of pretty good certainty, but also excitement, knowing that there's more things being found that gives us more information for us to make that decision.
Sure. Now, would you say the core truths of what the Bible communicates, like salvation, we are sinners, the need to believe by faith, the core hallmarks of Christianity, core theological views of Christianity that we talked about in season 1, those are all in line when it comes. Like, we are not going to discover something that will counter that of salvation through grace alone, right? you know, or
right.
Okay.
There is no essential doctrine
Okay.
that is affected by it. They are usually word orders.
Okay.
Maybe a misspelling. There is it's just simple things like that it would make a difference of, but nothing theological.
Okay. Now, we started talking about translations, like the updates, right? From NASB to Living, from the Holman to the New Christian Bible. And so when these modern, more smart professors that gather together to come up with these new translations, what are the basic approaches to Bible translation? How do they get there?
Sure. Yeah. Now, first, it's really important that we have new translations. It's a good thing.
Oh, okay.
I know that there are some who just want to stick with the 1611 King James, not knowing that there's been like 38 versions of the 1611, right? So it's like, which version are you talking about? Yeah. But it's important because the drive is, number one, you want to communicate theology accurately. You want to be true to the original language, but yet you also want to stay current with the original language as well. And so I ran across this illustration from 1675 when there was a fellow by the name of Sir Christopher Wren who was taking a look at the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral.
Okay.
And he said it was awful, amusing, and artificial. Right? and you might be insulted by his comments here, but back then, awful meant awe-inspiring, amusing meant amazing, and artificial meant artistic. Right? And so just a case in point that words mean different things back then, and that's why, even though I grew up with the King James, I never really understood. I couldn't understand half the words that were used there, just because we don't use them in our modern language, and that's why even reading like from the New Living Translation, where it uses the words that I use, is somewhat comforting. But there's two major goals when it comes to Bible translations among those committed to the authority of God's Word.
Okay.
Right? And that is, one is word by word, another is phrase by phrase. Do you interpret the Bible literally, which is word by word, or what's called formal equivalence, or literal, or do you translate phrase by, or thought for thought? That's called a dynamic equivalence. Now, the strength of being more literal is you're more accurate. But then when you're more accurate, you lose readability. When you translate thought for thought, the benefit is it's more readable, but then you lose the literalness of how it is phrased. So let me give you an example of an extreme translation here of Matthew 1:18. Here's the literal translation. But Jesus Christ, the birth thus was, being betrothed, the mother of him, Mary, to Joseph, before or to come together them, she was found in belly, having from Spirit holy.
Nice.
So that's literal. But he said, here's another one. John 4:5 says to him, the woman, Sir, give to me this the water that not I thirst, nor I come here to draw. All right. So you kind of get the idea that when it's literal, it's harder to read. But when when you're thought for thought, then you can lose the literalness of it. So there's that debate between formal equivalence or literal translation versus that which is word for word, and you kind of want to have both. You kind of want to have both. So let me give you an example from the more literal New American Standard. Romans 3:21, versus the NLT, which is more of the dynamic equivalent thought, right? So the literal New American Standard. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. Right? So, literal, but pretty readable. Mm-hmm. New Living Translation of Romans 3:21. But now God has shown us a way to be made right with him without keeping the requirements of the law, as was promised in the writings of Moses and the prophets long ago. All right, so it sounds pretty different.
Yeah.
One's more literal, and then the other one is saying, I can get that. Let me give you one more. Something that you're probably familiar with, Psalm 1:1, because we memorized that when we were kids. New American Standard. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of the scoffers. Here's Psalm 1:1 in the New Living Translation. Oh, the joys of those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or stand around with sinners, or join in with the mockers. So, again, they're translations from the original. They're both versions, but one has the thought by thought goal, and the other one has the word for word goal. And so that's the difference between the two thoughts of. And then then you're trying to do both.
Yes.
And so.
Okay.
So some know they're going to be more phrase by phrase because they're aimed for the readability. Some know that they're going to lose readability by being more literal, and then there are those trying to aim for Goldilocks just right.
Okay, got it. Now we're communicating versions that are English. These are English. Now again, I sound so American, but English is just more of the dominant language today, and we, out of any other language, English has the most versions. From what I read, I studied, has the most. But there are other languages, other cultures that are increasing its versions, right? Or its translations of that language, of that same language. But how did we get? Let's just talk about the English versions because we have the most. How did we get? How did the Bible get to us in English? Yeah.
That itself is a great story, too. I mean, there's so many great stories on it. Not only how the Bible was written, but the English Bible. I mean, out of the top 10 best-selling Bibles in the world, 9 of them are English.
Yes.
And then there's the Lorena Bible, which is, I think, the number 6 one in Spanish.
Spanish, yep.
But how we got the English Bible, knowing that the English language really started to come about 5th, 6th century, because of the Anglo-Saxon Germanic tribes coming into England and importing that language. And so it was. It's interesting to see. We start seeing a fellow by the name of Caedmon in 678. He was a musical cow herder. He was putting Bible stories into English songs. All right, so he would have been the Pastor Chris Wong of the day there, particularly Genesis, Exodus, and Daniel.
Okay,
and then we start to see Venerable Bede. Who was a name out of history, 675. He's called the father of English history. He completed a translation of John. And so we start seeing these things kind of in what we would call the Old English.
Now, these are versions.
These would be...
Or translations. I mean, like, are they looking at Hebrew and Greek to get to where they're at?
They were probably coming from the Latin.
Okay, got it. Okay, sounds good.
So,
all right.
So they wouldn't have necessarily been versions.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So because around that time, the Latin was the official and popular Bible from Jerome, the Vulgate. Vulgate where we get a word vulgar means common.
Common.
So it was just the common Bible.
Got it.
Until people stopped speaking Latin.
Yes.
And
had no idea what they were saying at church.
Right. Now it's no longer common.
Yes.
Yeah. And then moving on in time, the one who brought us the Bible, who brought us the complete Bible, was a man by the name of John Wycliffe. He lived. He was born in 1324, and he was called the Morning Star of the Reformation. He grew up in Roman Catholicism, but he repelled as a reformer on the idea of work salvation, the selling of the forgiveness of sins, which is called an indulgence, and the concept of transubstantiation, where the communion elements actually turned into the body and the blood of Christ. Yep. And so he held to sola scriptura. The Scripture is the sole authority of the church, and that was his passion. And so his translation was inspired because he believed that everybody has the right to read the Scripture. See, now we're headed towards the end of the Middle Ages. Yeah. The Latin Bible was, the Vulgate was the popular Bible for 1,000 years, but now nobody's speaking Latin anymore. Yeah. And so, but yet the Roman Catholic wanted to keep it Latin because if the common people actually read the Bible, they would know what the errors are and the Pope's false claims,
the political claims that they were,
all of these types of things going on. So you keep them ignorant by keeping the Bible out of their hands.
Exactly. Now, was Wycliffe a peer to... Everyone knows when it comes to Reformation, they think of Luther. Was he considered a peer to Martin Luther?
He was before.
Before, okay. Yeah. Good to know.
Right. So he completed the New Testament in 1380, the Old Testament in 1382. And so, remember, this is before the printing press. And so they were all copied by hand. It would take 10 months if you wanted a copy of Wycliffe's Bible.
Imagine.
And so it would take 10 months. And there was a group of folks called the Lollards who would copy and put these Bibles and distribute the Bibles within England. And there was the Roman Catholic Church rejected this translation, and there was they destroyed as many Wycliffe Bibles as they could. There's 170 of the Wycliffe Bibles still in existence, all handwritten before 1430. Wow! But Wycliffe died of a stroke. Yeah. And Wycliffe is a great story. Okay. After Wycliffe was a guy by the name of Tyndale, William Tyndale. Oh, yeah. And so William Tyndale was educated in Oxford and then at Cambridge under Erasmus, who we talked about with the Textus Receptus. And so he would also have that same desire. Now, he met Martin Luther.
Got it.
And so he would have been more of a contemporary with him than Wycliffe was. He would come up with a translation that was based on the Greek. So Wycliffe got it from the Latin. So he took Latin into English. Tyndale wanted to get the Greek New Testament into English, and so his was a very clear version. He also was persecuted and he was martyred in his dedication. And if you look at our notes today are 81 pages. It'll be available on the website, but we go into more of a biography of these guys. And then from there, the King James version in 1611, and that was that became very popular after that. And then with the printing press, it was just an amazing proliferation now of scriptures that once took 10 months to copy, now can be printed fairly quickly.
Wow. That's great. Yes. The English, and I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like the push to translate from Latin to English by these men like Wycliffe and Tyndale has then led this huge push with the principle of we need the commoners, the people, to have the Word of God in their own language, in their own cultural context and understanding. That has led to the push of other translations or versions in countries in their original language or in their native language, right? And so the story of how it came from Latin to English has influenced that principle has influenced the entire world in that regard. And
I mean, even the mission board that I'm a part of, Biblical Ministries Worldwide, is targeting, for example, Indonesia and 20 people groups that don't have a Bible in their language.
Wow.
All right. And so there's still a huge need out there for Bible translation
Okay.
to the modern age of people.
All right.
I give you those statistics on the very top of our 81 pages of notes.
So now let's talk about, one of the things that I realize again, as a church, as pastors, is there are some things that we're very strong on. There's some things that we're loose on, open-handed, but we still hold to. You are known as the middle of the road theologian, at least in my view. Middle of the road in practice, in a good way. In a good way.
Oh,
I
okay,
think it's
all
in a good way. You're not legalistic in the way in which you approach things. Very open in that way. I know that there are certain churches, prominent pastors, certain parts of the world, and especially in the United States, where they can be very legalistic in its view on what Bible they must use, right? For the longest time, and it still is today, it would have been the King James Version, right? There's huge debate. Should you use this? And if you don't use this, you're a sinner, right? They're drawing lines in that regard. How should we respond, or how should we act when it comes to versions of the Bible? How should we see these things? Yeah.
No, that's...
And translations, yeah.
That's great. Yeah. First, within the broader scope of evangelism, I think that we are wealthier because of a variety of translations today. And I know that there are some groups that are very narrow about their translation preferences, and they'll have their reasons.
Yeah.
Right, like the King James would say, well, the Textus Receptus is the bomb diggity.
Yep.
Right, and so if you came from Nestle Aland or Westcott and Hort, then you're a flaming liberal.
Yeah.
Right. So they would have their biases, which I think are just overstated. And
Okay.
I actually have probably about 15 pages at the end of our notes dedicated to the arguments against those who try to argue that King James is well, they believe it's the inspired translation, which is just weird.
Yeah.
Right. So some people can be really mad at me for that one, but not from
We love
California.
you still. We love you.
From Florida.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that can be a position, and like having grown up, the first Bible I was handed was a King James Version Bible. Right, so I started memorizing in King James, and then I started scratching my head, well, I don't talk with these and thous, and so when the New King James came, I said, oh, all right, it has the same phraseology as what I memorized in the King James, but now I can understand it a little bit more. It's like how I talk, right? So for the longest time, we used the New King James, and then and then when the NIV came out, that was very readable.
Yeah.
We started giving those to kids and youth in our youth ministry, and as a very readable translation. And the New American Standard Bible was also great, and so like sometimes I would study from there.
Yeah.
And when the ESV came out, now I'm preaching out of the ESV, and and if some publisher wants to give me some of their newer translations, that'd be fine too. I'll check that out too.
Yeah.
And so because I'm not smart enough to do all that work on the
even though you have 81 pages of notes, not smart enough, but that's okay.
Well, it was all written in English about this topic, but to go through every verse and then to give you a
Pastor Steve version,
an opinion, I'm just
the Wong
I'm just
version.
not that smart. So that's why I'm not so opinionated on it. I am grateful for the variety of translations. I like to read a different translation and benefit from that.
Sure. Well, that leads to my next question, and I also, the last two kind of questions. This is more application. We're going to close it out. What's a good way for our listeners to select Bible a Bible translation, a Bible version today? What's your opinion on that? What's a good way to kind of evaluate?
Right. Yeah. First, I think we can go to the publishers, and a lot of them are on the websites. In fact, yesterday, as I was upgrading our notes, I was on a lot of the different publishers' websites, from Holman to the Legacy, and just reading their forwards, and you can see what type of commitment that they have to the authority of Scripture. And that can be pretty broadly known. And so, among evangelicals, there are favorites among those who believe in the authority of Scripture. Among liberals, they have their favorite translations too. right? And so, and then you can see the differences between kind of a liberal bias versus those who are trying to be truer to the text, versus more contemporary with the culture, and its translation. And so you want a text that seeks to be faithful to the original, and then also with theological orthodoxy, right? Like some will just kind of write out the virgin birth and just say, oh well, she was just an Alma young woman, and and then just try to de-emphasize the fact that Jesus was born of a virgin. Yeah, and then and so theologically, you're looking at that, and then readability. Read it. Now we get all these samples. You can almost all these translations you can get online. Yeah, and you can just click
for
a button
free
on the same website and just read the different ones and just say which one is readable for me. Yeah, and then when you're selecting a Bible, what do you want? It's nice to have a paper Bible to read out of. I know a lot of times we're using the phones, but study notes, how important is that to you? Some people like journaling, so they want to have the wide margins so that they can write their notes in their journals, cross references, concordance, maps, and all these different types of things. So you're looking at that, and then even down to the type of material that your Bible is covered with. A hardback versus there's cheap leather that's going to flake apart because they bonded leather is where they take leather and then they glue it together and that breaks apart, versus spending premium money where you get like solid piece of leather, vellum or whatever, right? Yeah. So and so all those factors can help us decide from it. And then I think it's good to have several translations too. And so I enjoy reading several translations and benefit from that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. We'll get a little more personal on what versions you actually personally prefer. But yeah, I would agree. I think when it comes to selecting a Bible, I don't like that question because I think for most of our listeners, you have the luxury of not just selecting one, but many. Just on a website alone, on your phone, on the app on your phone, you have 100 different versions or translations of the Bible you have access to. If you're thinking of purchasing a Bible, my goodness, you go on Amazon and you can buy a hardback ESV study Bible for less than $30. 1 day shipping or same day shipping. And then you can get the New Living Translation study Bible for under $30. So it's less than $60. And if you think that that's expensive, you can spend that money just on lunch, right? And you have two solid quality versions that help us get back to the original, either literal or meaning for meaning, that'll help. And you can supplement. You can read both Bibles at the same time. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not sacrilege, or you're not being a sinner by doing that. I think we just have a huge, like you said, wealth. We are privileged in the fact that we have so many different English versions, and it's good to have the perspective of confidence. That yes, there may be many versions, but there's confidence that it is that minds that love Jesus Christ, have a relationship with Jesus Christ, want to get to its to the readers so that they understand God, and we should use that to our benefit. Right. And so that leads me to the question. Well, I'll answer and then you can answer. What Bible translations do you use and for what purpose for us as pastors, right? I think that's we kind of set the example, and I already mentioned it. I use two versions, and maybe you use the same. I use the ESV and the New Living Translation, right? English Standard Version and the New Living Translation. And the reason why I do that is ESV is, for me, has a good balance between literal and meaning, right? It's more on the literal side, and it's just helpful for me to preach and to teach and to study and understand kind of the flow of thought in its going back to the original kind of meaning or translations of the Bible. And then for my personal growth and relationship with Christ, I use the New Living Translation because it does err much more on the side of meaning for meaning. I wouldn't say it's like the Message, which I don't claim to be a translation or a version of the Bible. And I don't even think Eugene Peterson would call it a Bible. But some do, but I don't. But the New Living Translation is just helpful for me to understand meaning for meaning. I personally would not necessarily preach from that on a Sunday, but maybe, on a casual devotional, I might use that to help capture the emotions and the meaning behind it. But that's kind of where I'm at on that scope. Those are the two versions that I simultaneously would always have when it comes to reading Scripture.
Twinsies!
Yeah! That's too simple. Why?
Yeah. I preach out of the ESV.
Okay.
And actually, the ESV was the conservative evangelical revision of the RSV.
Yep.
And so it's a literal translation published 2001. It has 8th to 10th grade reading level. Mm-hmm. And so,
which is where I'm at. No,
yeah,
just
well, I'm lower than you.
Oh,
so the ESV I find a pretty good translation to preach from and find confidence in studying it. And like I said, I do enjoy reading out of the New Living Translation.
Yeah.
I like doing my devotions out of that. It's written on a 6.3 grade level. And see, there's a lot of people that say, oh, the New Living Translation, isn't that just like a living Bible?
Yeah.
Well, it's related to the Living Bible in the sense that Ken Taylor was behind it.
Yes.
Right? But Ken Taylor, with his backing and funding, he got 90 evangelical scholars from various denominations, and then they took they sought a dynamic equivalent translation from the Biblia Hebraica from Stuttgart.
Yep.
And then the United Bible Society's Greek text, 4th edition.
Oh, wow.
And so it's actually a translation.
Yeah.
So Ken Taylor, what he did was a paraphrase.
Got it.
But then he invested into having a more
robust, actually, Bible.
Translation
Yep.
that's more thought by thought.
Yes.
And that's why it's more readable, but it's more literal.
Yeah.
And and I've actually seen people like Chuck Swindoll.
Yeah.
Use the
New Living Translation.
in
Yep,
his
that's
preaching,
right.
And sometimes I will cite the NLT.
Yeah. Exactly.
Just because it can say things in a way that can be very, very clear and helpful.
Well, that's great.
But like I said, I grew up in New King James. New King James helped me. So like the Bible memory is probably still
in
the New King James.
Like the Lord's Prayer when I say it, right?
Right.
It's very New King James. Yeah.
Yeah. And then probably the Bibles we give away here at church, they're
ESV.
They're either ESV or NIV.
NIV, yep.
Right, and we like that one too, the older one.
Yes. Yeah, the older NIV. Well, that's great. Thank you, Pastor Steve. I think I want to go back to, or I'll just end with this kind of the legalistic way in which many people have kind of viewed Bible and Christianity. This is a stem from a very legalistic view of Christianity of there's only this version is the right version and nothing less. And, if a pastor preaches for how dare you? And I would say that, again, there's huge confidence in all the translations that what God wants to communicate is being communicated in its appropriate form. And there are great scholars, greater than I and greater than most of us, who criticize what version is right. Trust me, they've dedicated their lives to this. So kind of a little jab, who are you to question them, right? And it's not just one person. I'm sure there's a collective of individuals working on this to get to where it is today, to its original. Everyone's seeking to go back to its original intent, and you have to give them credit for that. And I think because of that, when it comes to pastors, when it comes to you yourselves choosing the right Bible, what versions to study, what versions to do Bible study off of, you really have to know your audience. I know a pastor that the church that I grew up at, he went from NIV to ESV, and then he said, I introduced him to the New Living Translation. He's like, I love it. I'm going to preach from it because I think our congregation needs it. Great. I'm not going to judge him for it because he knows his flock better and what feeds them the best, right? It's not being legalistic. It's about what the people need most, right? And that was the original intent behind going from Latin to English. The people need the Bible in the way that it makes most sense.
Right.
And so...
But I also, too, out of respect, when I go travel to speak somewhere,
Yes.
I'll ask what the preferred translation is. Or they give me a list of, like I went to go speak at one conference ground, and they said, of these 5 translations you can use.
Yes, yeah. And
So,
that's great.
Right.
That's
right.
awesome. Because again, you're catering toward the congregants, what they need, how in which they like their eggs cooked. Yeah. And so... Well, thank you, Pastor Steve, for your time. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in on transmission and translation of the Bible. I hope that was helpful. If ever you guys have questions about what versions, please come talk to us. We'd be happy to help you. If you're interested in what quality of Bible, please come talk to me. My wife knows I'm a collector of fine things, which is not good as a pastor, but I love Bibles and quality Bibles. I know Andrew has a really nice Bible, by the way. He was our missionary speaker with like the appropriate gilting, which is like the gold on the outside. But nonetheless, come talk to me if you want more of that. But yeah, please, we're here for you. We're a resource for you, and we hope that this podcast was helpful for you in choosing the right versions and translations. Thank you again for tuning in. See you guys and talk to you guys next week. Have a good one. Bye.